Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. This episode, we will handle Genesis 25 and 26. We're coming up quickly on chapter 32, Mike, and you and I have both, as we've talked about it privately and even on other podcasts and just conversation, anyone who deals with Genesis 32, which is coming up, realizes it's one of the most pivotal stories in ancient Israel, because it's the naming of Jacob as Israel. And then there's that famous wrestling with an angel story. And let's get the listener ready for that a little bit, because when we come to 32 in about 2 or 3 podcasts from now, we will have studied something rather extensively, you and I, and it would be good to let the listener know what we're studying ahead of time so they could possibly study it too. So you mentioned to me some books that 2 of which I'm going to need to buy, and one that I have somewhere in my in my piles. But can you overview what we're going to be looking at as far as books for the Genesis 32 podcast coming up?
So Dr. Heiser had based a lot of his content and sort of his trajectory and his theological development on Alan Siegel, who was a Jewish scholar down at Baylor University, who wrote this very pivotal work called the Two Powers, the Two Powers in Heaven, if I remember, that's the name. Mm-hmm. And essentially that is the main research book that Mike was drawing his ideas about the two Yahwehs, where you have a Yahweh in heaven and a Yahweh on earth, and that it's playing off of ideas from Canaanite, Baal kind of religious motifs. And Siegel's main work at that time when he wrote it, I think it was written around the early 80s, its focus was on how previous to his work, the assumption was the two powers doctrine was really just a Jewish branch off of Greco-Roman thinking and philosophy, of Gnosticism in some sense. And his work was actually to decipher and sift out. And the basic conclusion was, no, this was an actual Jewish development of thinking, that it was deemed heretical by the rabbis later on in the centuries. But around the time of Jesus's day, the Second Temple period, it was one of the more popular kind of interpretations of passages like Genesis 32, how to handle these moments where it seems like there are two Yahwehs or two powers. Other researchers over the years, they've been digging more into that, because Siegel's conclusion was that this was a Jewish heresy that was rightly condemned by the rabbis, especially by the medieval periods. But the 2 other books that Ron and I will be looking at that further dig into this material, the first one that came out a few years ago is called The Glory of the Invisible God. Subtitle is Two Powers in Heaven Traditions and Early Christology. It's written by a man named Andrei Orlov, O-R-L-O-V. And it's a further exploration of the Two Powers material. You can get that on Logos at a cheaper price. I would definitely recommend that if possible. And the one that just came out actually was just released last week. I had gotten a clue about it a few months earlier, so I had pre-ordered the actual physical book because I didn't find it on Logos. But it turns out it's actually also on Logos at over 60% off the price of the hardcover. It's called Israel's Lord, and the subtitle is Yahweh as Two Powers in Second Temple Literature. It's written by 2 guys, David Wilhite, W-I-L-H-I-T-E, and Adam Wynn, W-I-N-N. So Ron and I will be talking about especially Genesis 32, and we'll be going into these like 3 materials. And I have a feeling that in the end, Ron and I will still land on different positions, but at least to give this a good thorough exploration, because, Dr. Heiser was very much into, he disagreed with, obviously with Siegel's conclusion that it was a heresy. He thinks that ultimately that Second Temple period was what informed a lot of the proto-Trinitarian thinking from the early church. that was a little bit of some of his side research. I remember he asked me to, he invited another guy to dig into early church fathers' writings about divine counsel. And he sent me this huge file of of essentially all the way up to I think the 5th or 6th century of early church writings that alluded to a council or to supernatural beings or angels and that kind of stuff, and all these allusions. And it, even though the church got more and more Gentile as the centuries went on, it would logically make sense that if the early apostles taught their immediate students and disciples the ideas of that were found common in two powers, that eventually that would eventually have a trajectory towards what we eventually see by the Council of Nicaea, where many of the church fathers just sort of assume well, we all know this, right? And it's no, not everyone knew this.
Right. Well, very good. Yeah, thank you. Because as I was saying, when we get to 32, we may take an entire episode just preparing us for chapter 32, because however or whatever presuppositions you go into 32 with, you're probably going to come out with. In other words, our Christian Bibles will capitalize the G on God, just to prepare everyone. If you turn to 32, Genesis 32, you have Jacob wrestling, and it says, you have struggled with God and men and have prevailed. That's what the being in verse 28 says to Jacob. You have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Now, the Jewish Study Bible has, you have struggled with a divine being and have prevailed. So, in other words, the same text, Masoretic text, can lead a person to translate it two different ways. And what we'll be talking about, of course, is the tremendous difference between these two separate ways of interpreting it. So that'll be fun. Thank you, Mike, for looking ahead on that and preparing me and helping me to get a hold of some new works that I've not seen. So it reminds us that the best way to study this divine counsel theme is just read voraciously, read everything you can get your hands on. And just presume, as you well said too, Mike, we may come out of that conversation with different views. Mike and I did, and that's to be expected. That a divine counsel worldview does not have a monolithic stance on every text by any means. And if anything, it helps the person who has the worldview at least know the options. And coming out of a text, or even going into a text, what are my options going in? When it comes to a divine counsel worldview concept, remember way back, I think it was even our first episode, we went over 6 things that I recommended comprise a divine counsel worldview. Very quickly, just to remind us of these, even for the first time listener now. Number 1, you read the text according to the original culture, writer, audience. Think left to right. Don't pack things into the text that haven't happened yet. Always think in terms of the original author. Second, and that's not unique to a divine counsel worldview, but it is necessary to a divine counsel worldview. And number 2, Scripture presumes that there is a society of created Elohim, gods, divine beings, whatever we want to call those in the Old Testament, that were created and they exist. They're real. The gods of the first commandment are real, is an easy way to saying it. Number 3 is huge. At an early point in this story, we're not sure exactly when, these beings were delegated power, authority over the nations, over even regions, shall we say. And here's where a concept of cosmic geography gets in play. So, and then the 4th one gets to Jesus. In other words, when we come to Jesus, he is going to be the head of this principality, this group of principalities and powers in the New Testament. But the first 3 points, as I reviewed them there, as straightforward as those 3 are, it's amazing by the time you get to those 3 or through those 3 and explain them, you have usually lost the audience, or someone who's not familiar with divine counsel issues is saying, wait a second here. I have to reread this, in other words. And I would say, yeah, that, and I think you'd say the same, that with those 3 ideas in tow, that we read it according to the original writer, gods exist, and they have a lot of power. Once we've laid that out as presuppositions as going into the text, then our talking points are different, and even our conclusion points, I think, are multiplied. So, well, we'll get there. But let's today handle 25 and 26. There are parts of these chapters or these stories, again, going back now to the story of Abraham and Sarah today. In fact, Abraham is going to die. Several parts of these chapters, I would say, don't really relate to a necessary divine counsel read on things. So, again, I would recommend having a load of study Bibles around you, especially cultural study Bibles and things like that. My favorite, again, is the N. I don't know if it's just by the version, but the Cultural Background Study Bible by Zondervan. I keep it close at hand. The version I have uses the New King James Version. I don't know if it comes out in different versions, but
it does. I have the NIV version.
Oh, okay. Cultural Background Study Bible. That's very, very helpful. And I will be alluding to it at times, quoting from it, and often, if not always, at least having it in mind, what's behind it. So, all right, 25 begins with the introduction of Keturah. We were told back in 23 that Sarah died. We're not sure if Keturah was a woman involved in the family of Abraham, the extended tribe of Abraham before Sarah dies, but this is our only introduction to her, and frankly, our only mention of her in the story. And she's called a wife or a woman of Abraham, but probably more like a concubine or a second wife in their culture. Again, because these families were small economies unto themselves, and so it was almost necessary. Can I say it that way? Back in this world, it was almost necessary to have a large family that even one woman could not, bear enough children to be providing this kind of sustenance for a large tribe. So not uncommon. Again, by the time you get to the New Testament, one man for one woman seems to be the norm, but we are not there yet. So verse 5 is important. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Remember, the story, though, is going through the son of Abraham's first wife or loved wife, Sarah. And this idea of a covenant or, it doesn't say covenant in 25:5, but it implies it, that the covenant that God made with Abraham is going through Isaac. And one of the themes that once you see it, you can't unsee it in the Bible, I would say, would be when you see phrases like the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. Those kind of phrases are particularly meant to be read as not capital G there. I would take that capital G off again and say the divine being of Abraham. Well, who is that? That's the being that we now know as Yahweh. Whether they use that name at that time, we're not sure. At least that's a matter of debate. But the idea that the God of Abraham is the creator of, Genesis 1:1, but there are many other gods out there that Abraham had or could have. The competition for worshiping a certain deity is afoot, and the God of Abraham is now the God of Isaac, and that's what makes the covenant move through him. It's not just a whimsical thing. It's which God Isaac worships. So as we move into the story, go ahead.
Well, and also just for the listeners to kind of as a quick reminder, right, that verse 5 is important. Yes, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, as my version here in the ESV says it that way. But we also have to remember geographically, they were all at three different spots after that event on Mount Moriah. That some reason, however we want to understand that, Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah were all at three different triangulated locations.
I think it's the size of the tribe by this point.
It could be. It could be for other reasons as well. But it's interesting, right, ultimately, is that Abraham and Isaac are not within close proximity. And so there is almost like this explicit need in verse 5 to ensure, yes, what Abraham had is going to Isaac, partly because it just could not be immediately assumed, because they're not in locational proximity towards each other. And so that had to be clarified in some sense, I felt.
Yeah, and that's kind of hinted at in verse 6. Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which he had, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward. So notice Isaac is the covenant-bearing son through the God that he's worshiping, but then he sends apparently other sons through other women east, and that east always has a hint of other God worship in mind. Kind of spooky, frankly. Well, in verse 7, we have the ending of Abraham's life. Verse 8, Abraham breathed his last, died a good old age, ancient way of saying it was a good death, or he fulfilled his purpose on earth. Gathered to his people, again, very cultural way of describing death, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him. So he dies at 175, and verse 11, came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. Again, if there's any question about which God Isaac worshipped, there we have just kind of that reminder that the God that we're dealing with is the one that's blessing Isaac.
And also, and just also there is that, the sad reality, right? Because Abraham and Isaac were living at two different locations, Abraham never got to actually bless Isaac, right? Like the way that Isaac would later on want to do for his own sons, Abraham couldn't do that for Isaac himself.
Interesting.
And so it's interesting that, yes, that God specifically blessed Isaac, as though it's almost like,
as though Abraham didn't have the chance.
Yeah, Abraham didn't have the chance, or really just like this need culturally to feel like you got your father's blessing, and God takes in, like, basically fills in that vacuum, that role. Like, you need someone specifically to bless you. I will do that, Isaac.
Yeah, and we're going to see that story coming up with Isaac and his two boys. All right, verses 12 to 18 are the genealogy, and really it's the signing off on the story of Ishmael. That's the son, again, through Hagar. If you remember back in 16, he's born to Hagar. He's said to be a wild donkey of a man, a way of describing a man free from the constraints of the sedentary lifestyle. It was hinted at back in 16 again, and this is God making a covenant through Isaac, but blessing Ishmael. God can do both. That this man would be, Ishmael, a man of conflict, a man of war, a man of unease, especially among his own brethren. He's later expelled by Sarah in chapter 21. And in fact, talk about something that we're going to have to bring back up, Mike, in chapter 32 when we get there. Back in 21, I forget if we made this comment or made a deal of it, but in 21:17, then an angel of Elohim, and there's no article on Elohim there, calls to Hagar. Did we talk about that? That possibly back in 21:17,
yes, we did talk about
Hagar.
this.
Yeah,
yes,
could have been a messenger of another Elohim, because the phrase where's my little post-it note? A messenger of Elohim without an article is very rare. We're going to have in 31 coming up a messenger of the Elohim, referring to the Elohim in the story, which is clearly Yahweh. And other, in Exodus and Judges and stuff, we have a messenger of the Elohim, and in each case, the Elohim is Yahweh. But it's a rare textual way of describing a messenger to say a messenger of an Elohim, or at least no article. And here is the first one in 21:17. The next time it happens is 1 Samuel 29:9. And it's just a general statement made by David about the privilege of being a messenger of an Elohim, as though he's not trying to draw it into one particular one. So anyway, I'm just saying that this question that which God are we talking about is so, again, you can't unsee it once you start looking for it. And when we come now to 25 and are talking about the genealogy of Ishmael, what we have is a man from the story. Again, look at 13. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nebajoth, and then I'm not going to pronounce all these names. 16, these were the sons of Ishmael. These were their names by their towns, their settlements, 12 princes. That's a prediction from 1720. Genesis 17:20, according to their nations, their goyim. The sense you're getting from the writer is that Ishmael leads nations, plural, that are not Israel. Okay. These were the years of his life, 137 years. He breathed his last and died. They dwelt, verse 18, from Havilah as far as Shur, early name for Assyria, which is east of Egypt as you go toward Assyria, and he died in the presence of all his brethren. Again, 1612 had predicted this as a kind of a prediction of hostility. So the story of Ishmael is a nation of people, a people even of unusual blessing, who would be identified ultimately, it's not here, of course, but ultimately by Islamic tradition to be their head, the head of the Arab people. And again, you can't find the name in the Quran, but in modern Quranic interpretation, Ishmael is described as the chosen son of Abraham. I'm going to be quoting here from the Dictionary of Old Testament Pentateuch, the Pentateuch version, or the Pentateuch edition of the 7-volume dictionary of the dictionary series that put it out here? IVP put out. We all need this set, whether you get it on Logos or in paper. We all need it. It's very good. I'm going to be quoting from page 451 in this edition. The Quran identifies Ishmael as a prophet, but more importantly, as one of the ancestors of the Arab people and a worshiper of Allah, and it lists the texts. Another important variation from the biblical presentation is the Quranic view that Abraham bound Ishmael, not Isaac, to the altar at Moriah. And I'm not going to read more, but the point being, when we talk about the story of Ishmael, the Bible does not get into much. I mean, you really have very little said about Ishmael, except for when you get into Galatians chapter 4, again, without a name attached. He's clearly described as the other, the non-Isaac group. However, that played out in the days of Paul, writing Galatians. He saw Ishmael as the head of a group of people, or the nation, or nations, that symbolically signified those who were not of Isaac. And in Galatians 4:28, he even says, we are of Isaac, children of the promise. And you can almost put covenant behind the word promise there as a parallel term. So, long story short, I'm recommending, and I think I'm falling into normal interpretation here, for those who, do cultural background on the Old Testament. But here's the divine counsel spin on this cultural understanding, that when you come upon the name Ishmael, whether it's the nations that he is the father of, where they live, who they marry, how they relate to Israelites and later Jews, they are the arch enemy of God's people. How do they become the enemy? And to me, this is a divine counsel worldview issue, is which God they worship would be that answer. So I find it fascinating that when a modern day Muslim identifies with Ishmael and not Isaac, that they are making a judgment call on the which Elohim question in my mind. So any thoughts there, Mike, on Ishmael and that sort of question?
So, I think, we know, Ishmael himself will not show up again, but the Ishmaelites, his descendants, they do pop up interestingly right at a pivotal point for Joseph's story. Right? Mm-hmm. It's the Ishmaelites.
Genesis 37 is what you're referring to. Yeah.
Yep. It's the Ishmaelites who purchase Joseph from the brothers as they contemplated whether to murder him or not. And they just so happened to be going by, and Judah convinces the brothers, hey, we should, make some money off of this and sells Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So the Ishmaelites, by the time we get to, probably decades later, after Isaac and Ishmael saw each other the last time, that by that point, the Ishmaelites were trading into Egypt, and apparently part of that trade was slaves. And so it's an interesting kind of trajectory of a people to go towards the idea of human trafficking, and so there's that curiosity that happens. That's not good, but ironically, then it was still used to actually help further the story or the deliverance of the people God had, like Yahweh had chosen. The one thing I do put it, I do understand the concept, and the Hebrew does leave it ambiguous. And in the Faith Life notes, in the Faith Life Study Bible notes that Heiser was a part of helping write, the writers do take the comment that this angel or this angel of God could possibly be another version of the angel of Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
The Aramaic translation of Genesis 21:17, interestingly, the concept of the Targums, they came around the time when Aramaic became the more spoken language by the Jewish people, especially
During
after the exile.
Mm-hmm.
And so the verse 17, the Aramaic version of it translates it as, and the voice of the boy was heard. And they put italics to indicate where they're trying to kind of flesh out what the nuance of the words in Aramaic were. So was is italicized. And the voice of the boy was heard before the Lord. So that's italicized. And the angel of the Lord, italicized, was called to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Fear not, because the Lord has heard the voice of the prayer of the boy in the place in which he is." So it's interesting. By the time we get to around the time period of the Second Temple, the Aramaic translations, they're going to be, because this is a little bit of where the rabbis of that time period are explicitly trying to add a little bit of commentary.
They certainly do.
To clarify or what they think is going on, right? I always compare the Aramaic versions these days as well, just because it does help inform maybe what's going on around the time of the New Testament. Because this would be one of the sources that they would have as well for scriptures.
Yeah, and this is a interpretive question, if not an issue. If we want to build it up to the point of an issue, are the Targums authoritatively retelling sometimes the story of the original Hebrew? Maybe that's a text by text judgment call. I know that Judaism looks at the concept of inspiration differently than traditional Christianity does, at least evangelical Christianity, where we think in terms of a very static text. It's a textual call that, you come in on Sunday morning, the pastor says, turn to this text, and we think of, explaining the text. Whereas in Jewish tradition, rabbinical interpretations count as the text. So the way you interpret a text is listen to not just the text, but the rabbis interpret it as well. And that's why they keep minority and dissenting opinion often quite alive within the Jewish tradition, which that's the Talmud, where you're paging through all the different interpretations of a story. And they call that entire text, even of all the competing interpretations, their version of inspiration. So, we're backing way up and almost having to rethink a whole doctrine there. But anyway, let's pack that back up as quickly as we unpacked it, because we don't have time for it. But
I think, at least in response to what you're saying about is it authoritative? I would say, I can at least say for me personally, the Targums there, and this would be the same with the even Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint and other copies of like the Book of First Enoch. I think they're informative. Don't necessarily view them as authoritative, but they are informative, right? Because I think the way that Mike always liked to say it, he never said it that way, but he would say that, read, sort of like what we've been saying, read as much as you can, dive deep into the mindset of the time period. Right. And so if these are the materials that are floating about, then those are things that we should at least keep up in the air or have them have some play. I don't think that this is necessarily authoritative, but it did help me, at least when I was using the Targums in studying Job. It did give me an insight into how the rabbis by the time of the first century, they were looking at the time period of Job.
Yeah. And I recommend this to all divine counsel, wannabes, and I'm one. I'm wanting to have this worldview consistent in my head so that when I read the Bible, I'm thinking in their terms. It doesn't mean that I know what to think about each text, but it gives me more options, and I'm not as offended by one option over another. In my background, and Mike, I think you could vouch for this too. It's the very introduction of a divine counsel read on a text that sometimes can so throw an audience or throw an interpreter that they are defensive right off the bat, and they don't want to hear anymore because it doesn't agree with their tradition. And if anything, a divine counsel worldview does is kind of ease that angst, and you listen to the options better, I would hope. And again, I am not the quintessential person for this, but because I'm still struggling to be open-minded where I need to be, and it's hard to open your mind up and then clamp it back down again on what's solid, as Chesterton used to say. The purpose of a mind like a mouth is to chew on what's solid, and that is coming into biblical interpretations like this. So, all right, let's move on. 25:20, Isaac. So now we've let go of Ishmael. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife. Again, Rebekah is his cousin's daughter, so it's down one generation. She would have been about 20, we think. So Isaac has Rebekah. He's 40. And she was barren, verse 21. It's going to be 25 years that God waits to give Sarah a child. It's going to be 20 years here in this story. Again, God is very, very patient. She went to inquire of the Lord in verse 22 because she has twins in her womb, or really what she doesn't know is going on. I suppose at that point she just doesn't know at all. And so it says she goes to inquire of the Lord. That's an interesting idea. Notice she's inquiring of Yahweh. That's evidence again of which God this couple, Isaac and his wife, worship, which is good. We don't know how God gave information to her. The sense of verse 23 is that it's an objective, response. So my guess would be it's not just a thought in her head, or I suppose it could be a dream. It could have been a messenger again. It could be someone speaking for Yahweh, and the quotation marks literally coming from the mouth of a messenger, but counting for Yahweh. In verse 23, it says, Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. Again, very clearly there, you've got not just 2 boys, but the heads of 2 people groups. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So Jew-Gentile, I put that J/G lettering in my margin whenever I see any hint before the question of Acts 15, way down the road. We're going to have an entire, council, it's called, Council of Antioch, where they try to figure out what to do with this Jew-Gentile problem. Where does that start? You got to go way back in the Bible, and I would say beyond Genesis 12, moving now left to right, here's another one where we can say this is going to be not just incidental, but clearly important to the story of Jew-Gentile relations, that Jacob and Esau will perform kind of like a Isaac-Ishmael separation of not just people groups, but the question of which God these peoples worship. 24, so when her days were fulfilled, Rebekah gives birth, and she has twins. The first, verse 25, came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Edom and red have a philological similarity, and Esau is named based on the feel of his skin, apparently even coming out of his mom's womb. The year, by the way, is 2006 BC, if we're taking a tight genealogy. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. Whether, of course, could this boy have done it purposely I'd say no, but my guess would be that just the appearance of an arm or a hand wrapped around his brother's heel was enough to give him his name. So his name was called Jacob, and the word heel and Jacob, or the symbolic meaning of heel, sometimes is taken as trickster or deceiver. So all this is bound up within the name Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them, so that shows us how many years it took for her to have these two boys. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. And Isaac, and this is key to the rest of the story, Isaac loved or preferred, you could read it that way, Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved or preferred Jacob. So going into the story, as the boys grow into teenage and then adulthood, envision mom and dad siding with, through various stories that are going to be happening. Isaac is going to be siding with Esau, his firstborn officially, and Rebekah will be siding with the second one, Jacob. Anything jumps off the page to you, Mike, before we keep moving?
Well, if I remember correctly, this word especially, I think it's, I'm trying to read it in the Hebrew, havav. Unfortunately, it sometimes is used in the Hebrew to indicate almost like this. It is love, but it's like a favoritism kind of love, right, which generally is not good, especially within family structures where there's a favored child that seems to incite a little bit of jealousy or envy amongst the other siblings, and so it's interesting that both Isaac and Rebekah, they have their favorite. And so it feeds into almost what Yahweh had said to Rebekah in response to her question of what is going on inside her womb, that there are these two nations struggling. And it's interesting. It's interesting that in some sense, the favoritism that's being shown by both parents is playing into that, almost that prediction prophecy.
What's hard, I would even say, is that when you read stories like this, you wonder, is it predictive of what will happen, or is it in there as a sign of what did happen? In other words, if it weren't for how the story goes, where Isaac or Jacob and Esau head off in different directions and even lead different people groups, one serving the other, would we even have had verse 28 even mentioned? But other way around, because the rest of the story will go in the direction it does, the writer goes into the story backwards, as it were, and says, by the way, here is why it turns out the way it does. Isaac preferred Esau over his brother, and it was the other way around for his mom. So sometimes it could be actually predictive. Other ways, in other words, this idea of one people serving another within the same family may be there as a etiology, or it's there to tell us how things came out the way they did. Instead of, had you been there at the moment, would you have been stunned by the prediction? Maybe. Again, I don't know if we have to make a judgment call there, but it's always hard, and everyone who's read the Bible knows how the story's going to go here, so I'm not telling something out of school, but Jacob is going to trick his brother into a blessing coming up, and it's as though both Isaac is frustrated that he gave the blessing to the wrong person, and God himself is, shall we say, stuck with what Isaac does. In other words, I was teaching this not long ago in our church and just going through the text like we're doing here. And someone raised their hand and said, why did God go with Isaac's blessing on Jacob over Esau? And in other words, his point was, it's one thing for Isaac to make this mistake, but why would God go along with his mistake? And, I didn't have a quick answer as much as to say, is this the way God intended? I would say yes. Did it take Jacob's deception to do it on the story level? Yes. But maybe God's above all that. Maybe that's our best answer. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But it's coming into the story even now. where
Well,
we have to say, I think this is Ron talking. God is above history on the level of the outline of where it's going. So he wants to bless Jacob because Jacob will be a worshiper of his. He does not want to, in the same way, bless Esau because Esau will turn out not to be a worshiper of his. So to me, it's a which God question that then gets wrapped back into the story. And I am reading this not just as a narrative of this happens, then this happens, but I'm reading it as a way of understanding the worship question and how God is blessing one people because of their loyalty to him. So,
yeah, the story about Isaac and Esau and the way that the two parents react, right? Even the naming of Jacob, like all of that, I think are just factors that are part of the story. They clue us into what's going to be happening. But I do wonder in some sense, like this reminds me of like the Greek mythologies where a son is, predicted to slay his father, right? And so then the father hears about this prediction and then tries everything he can to avoid that prediction, but ironically actually feeds into the actual playing out of the prediction. Right. And so then there's always that question, right? It's like, if the father never heard the prediction, would he have done those actions that led to his own demise? Right. And sure. I think there's no way around it is that it seems to be that it's actually part of the actual playing out, right? It's all mixed together. You cannot easily separate it out. And so like this story itself is showing you can't really separate it out. Because like of all things, his baby hand happens to be holding Esau's like ankle, his heel. And that leads them to naming him a name that basically tells him, yeah, you're always going to be like a heel snatcher.
Yeah, right.
You're always going to be like a little deceiver. You're always tricky. And it's like, well, how is a child supposed to react when like he knows like, well, that's what my name means. Do I just live into that reality? or
yeah, exactly.
So anyways, it's good. It's good fodder to just kind of go back and forth on it. It is just how the narrative plays out. But it is just fun just to kind of think of like, that's interesting as a child growing up. And he kept hearing like, what does my name mean? Yeah. It's like, it means heel snatcher.
This gets into the God knowing the future and God ordaining the future question that any Christian obviously today, I would say, struggles with. If you spend any time in scripture at all, you have to wonder, is God running my life or is God observing my life? And to whatever degree those two options are bookends in that discussion, sometimes Calvinism and Arminianism are titles we give to that, but I think that's a bit overrated. We all struggle with this, or at least wonder about it all the time, because as I've told the story, my dad died in an accident where if he had just tied his shoes 10 seconds longer than he did that morning, he would not have died. And I can play that kind of question out, and you can too, with all sorts of what ifs to the point that you drive yourself mad. And you have to, even when I had two competing views in my own classroom at the college I was teaching at, I brought in John Piper and Greg Boyd to debate this in front of the students on separate days. They talked into a video camera both times, but when they debated this, it was fun. And I enjoyed it as a teacher. My students were kind of put off by the bookends of the version. They were hearing two vastly different views of God's knowledge of the future. And my point to the student was, I don't have an answer for you as much as I want you to be aware of how different good Christian preachers or teachers can be on this very basic question. And you'll probably fall somewhere in between these two. But I just found it fascinating how both of them could speak to this and use the Bible to defend themselves. That's also the case there. And of course that gets into this issue of Jacob and Esau. So I guess we'll have to let it go for now, but we're right on top of it when we come upon these kinds of stories. Let's go on to verse 29 of chapter 25. Now Jacob cooked a stew. They're probably well into their teenage years, at least by now. We don't know the timing of this story. Esau came in from the field. He was weary. Probably, by the way, and one of the study Bibles brings this up, that Jacob was probably out in the fields with a moving set of sheep herders, and he was the guy in charge of feeding them. That's his dwelling in tents line from verse 27. In other words, he was the domestic guy who kind of handled the food duties of the sheep herding crew. And so what we could envision here is that Jacob is, getting ready to feed the crew, and Esau, a guy from the field, literally, is coming in and very, very hungry. Esau says to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore, he's called Edom, again, a word or play on the word red. And then Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright." Primogeniture, I guess they call it. It's the privilege of the firstborn in ancient world thinking, where when it comes to property, you get sometimes a double portion compared to your brothers. So 4 brothers would divide the inheritance 5 ways, and the firstborn would get double. It also had the sense of a head of a tribe or head of a household. So he's selling him at this point the privilege, and maybe it's just one part of that, just the inheritance side of the material wealth that would come with being the firstborn. That's probably what's at stake here. Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die, so what profit shall be this birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him, and in that day your word was your signature, and sold his birthright, the privilege of the double portion, or the privilege of the firstborn when it came to material possessions. He sold that to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. So the story, of course, of Esau despising his birthright is more than, and the New Testament does this, by the way, in Hebrews chapter 12, after the great hall of faith story, which again, notice that Hebrews 7 through 10, I'm getting way ahead in my own thinking, but I always like to remind people of this when they're going to Hebrews, that as much as we want to talk about sin management, that's Hebrews 7 through 10, right? All the sacrifice material. Chapter 11 is not about sacrifice at all. It's about faith. It's about loyalty. So when you want to talk salvation issues, we're going to go to loyalty. When you want to talk sin management, you go to sacrifice, which is the previous 4 chapters. But anyway, when you finish out 12 or 11, of course, Esau is not part of 11. Because I would recommend, if we had Esau in chapter 11, it would undo everything we know about what loyalty means, because or at least my argument about Esau being a non-loyalist. However, Esau's name is mentioned in Hebrews 12, verse 15. "Look diligently lest anyone fall short of the favor of God." How would you do that? Well, you have bitterness that causes trouble. Many become defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane, unholy person like Esau. Esau is played off of chapter 11 in Hebrews 12, verse 16, as though he's the opposite of what loyalty would look like. So when we have this last line of chapter 25 of Genesis where it says Esau despised his birthright, it may just be a whimsical, oh, by the way, this is how he lost his inheritance rights. I think it's saying, here's how the story, again, predictively has Esau not being the head of his family, not being the head of the very family that comes to loyalty in Yahweh. In other words, this is the way, if you want to talk, nuts and bolts, how Esau heads off a different direction. And it's going to end by the end of the New Testament as him being, again, the head of a family that is literally non-Yahwistic from everything I can tell. And that's coming up in chapter 27 next time. When we have our next podcast, we'll take an entire time with chapter 27 and the story of Esau and Jacob, or Jacob tricking his father over Esau. So we'll do that later. Anything else before we head into 26?
Well, there is this interesting note from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, it has a little part here where it mentions about Esau selling his birthright. Why is this even a thing? Apparently, this was actually a custom that was in Old Babylonian and Nuzi inheritances, that brothers could actually buy and sell each other's birthrights or their inheritances to one another. I think it's an interesting thing, but when you get to verse 34, right, the writer is telling us that of all things, Esau sold his birthright for lentils and for lentil stew. And so it's like, are you kidding me? Your birthright is that cheap? you treated it as that like whimsically or trivial.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a right. It's actually kind of like an understatement in some sense. He despised his birthright. It's like, yeah, he did. And way more, that apparently it was nothing more worth than just a bowl of lentils. Which
points to his stupidity. And I'd recommend it ultimately points toward his irreligiosity when it comes to Yahweh too. And his, where the story ends up is far beyond stupidity. It's even a worship question for me. Yeah. But we have to get there. So let's do 26. Again, looking at this text, which is really the only biblical narrative dedicated to Isaac in the entire Old Testament. This is it. 26 is the only story that is, dedicated to the man Isaac. We have his story, of course, before and after when it comes to his boys and his wife. But this is the one that leads us to ask, and I'd like to look at it in this light because it's just a narrative. How does it answer the which Elohim question when it comes to Isaac? I think it does. The Lord appeared in verse 2. Yahweh appeared to Isaac in verse 2, which is a signal to me, again, that Isaac is a Yahwist. Doesn't have to be. We're going to have Yahweh appearing to all sorts of people, but I just find it very good to remember, which God again we're talking about. Yahweh appears to him and says, verse 2, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I tell you. It's just like Abraham, except Abraham wasn't in the land yet, and now Isaac already is. So now the argument is, stay here. This is the land I gave to your father. Verse 3, sojourn in this land, and I will be, that I will be in Hebrew, Hayah, is exactly the same form as in Exodus 3:14. When Moses asks God, who should I say sent me to you, Pharaoh? When Pharaoh asks, which God sent you, say, or what is your name? He says, I am that I am. That's usually how it's translated in Exodus 3:14. That's the same form here. So I will be who I will be would be another way of even translating Exodus 3:14. In other words, it's not a name. It's just a form of the verb, hayah. So I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. So I'd recommend verse 3 is as clear as you could get, that Isaac is a Yahwist. He has been not only tapped on the shoulder by Yahweh to say, you are the one through whom I'm going to be blessing the world because of your father, but it implies that Isaac is also worshiping the same God that has called his father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So it's a retelling of Genesis 12. I love verse 5 for what it again implies, that covenants, promises like this go both ways. We're not having Isaac nor Abraham be blessed by Yahweh in some kind of a one-sided deal. Because, verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my Torah. The idea that Abraham has been following Yahweh is key to the whole story. If Abraham had, perish the thought, turned away from Yahweh and began worshiping the gods of the lands of Canaan, this whole thing, I think, would have been off. God would have said, this is how the deal works. If you leave me, I leave you. And again, it sounds awfully, crass, but rash or crass. But but that's how covenants work. They are two-sided. It always, you always have this potential for forfeiture when you make a covenant. And so I think the point of verse 5 is saying it to his son. He's looking back upon the father saying, here is why we're still in covenant. Abraham kept my charge, voice, commandments, statutes, laws. Notice that perfection is not in play. We've not had any sense to this point in our story, and I will recommend it never happens that God has demanded perfection. That's a very fierce rumor that somehow started that God needs perfection. I don't know. Maybe I should even pause, Mike, and say, where did we get this horrific idea, Mike, that God needs perfection? I don't know where we got it. And I would like to claim it's a conspiracy of the highest order, but maybe I'm missing something.
I think it depends on the particular translations of how God, when he appears at Sinai to the people, being holy or being perfect, right? So it depends on
that
how...
Tamim thing. Okay. But Tamim, that was back in Genesis 7.
That's a much later conversation.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, let's handle it when we get there. But because Abraham obeyed my voice, the guy has already sinned several times. We know that. And yet God can say in very proud, like a father to a son, you obeyed me. I think it's big picture. It's which God questions. And even that word Torah, he has kept my Torah, which hasn't even happened yet, right? I mean, the Sinai covenant hasn't even taken place yet for 500 years. And Abraham's already following Torah because, again, Torah can be understood as a broader idea of ways or direction or thoughts. So he's a follower of Yahweh, having never seen Sinai legislation. For me, again, I'll throw this at you, Mike, see if you want to push back. This shows the relative unimportance of Sinai. The fact that you can have a man like Abraham 500 years pre-Sinai being said to follow Torah, having never seen Sinai, means, I'm taking it this way, that when we get to Sinai and we have the things coming, the 2 tablets coming down from the mountain, we can overestimate that story as saying, now finally we get to know God's will. And I would like to push back and say, no, we've had people following Torah before Moses, so we've got to give account for that. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I think the way, and also, right, we have to admit that we're both Westerners, and we've grown up with Western thinking. And so oftentimes, even when we see or read the word law, we immediately think of a certain context and a certain assumption behind that wording, right? Versus Torah or laws in their times are not necessarily judicial court written down in, some sort of binding, you could get arrested and thrown into jail kind of reasoning, but that this is about your wisdom or instructions, the guidance that is being offered, right? And so Abraham, technically, yes, he did follow God's instructions. He followed his guidance, his wisdom. He listened to him about, I'm going to try to be in this land and stay here. I left my family. So like he did do these things. So he is keeping his end of the covenant. I think it is a temptation for a lot of folks to make Sinai so important it becomes almost like a legalistic issue. I think Sinai is important in that it ultimately brings up to the people of God, well, what kind of people are we supposed to be in the context of Canaan? How are we going to look like? How are we going to act? What are the things that we're supposed to value because these are the things that God values? Yeah. And so I think those are things that are being answered, but not necessarily to a point of you have to keep these to an exact, almost overbearing adherence. If it gets to the point that they become more important than actual expressed loyalty or faithful love towards Yahweh.
In fact, let me read to you. I just woke up this morning before we came on to do the podcast. I had an email from someone, And I love these. I mean, these are emails I get from people because of the podcast or other things, and I don't know them and they don't know me except, through the podcast. And he says, "Hi, Ron, how are you? In a recent podcast, you mentioned that we are often too focused on sin and explained that God came to redeem the nations back to himself, contrasting with the scattering of nations in Genesis 10. That's a good read. I'm glad he caught that. This idea intrigued me and raised some questions about the necessity of Jesus' death. Why the cross? Why the atonement? Why the New Testament?" In other words, good question, and I'm going to have fun responding to him, and I'm going to say the same thing I've often said to other questions like this. I think what we're doing is we're thinking backwards. We're saying because the death of Jesus is so important and he died for sin, somehow I've got to package that for sin concept backwards into the Old Testament and make it work. In other words, if I'm having sin on the right side of the story, I've got to go back to the Old Testament side, the left side, and figure how that's working. And I would, I'll respond to him here. I'll say, I think we're overestimating the word or the concept of sin in the sense that dying for sin, we take to be a penal substitution thing, that we demanded perfection and Jesus gave it to us and God thus, gets it from Jesus, but not us. To me, that's a wholly invented idea that you aren't going to get if you're following, for example, the story of Abraham. There's nothing in Abraham's story that would give us the sense of sins piling up behind this man's account, and he needs some kind of perfection to give to Yahweh, and Yahweh demands it, and he's sacrificing to get rid of that. In other words, that whole story that we bring into it, to me, is foreign to our story now. And let's see, how can I finish my answer there? It's like saying, Tiger Woods won the golf tournament. He had a good weekend. Well, did he have a bogey? Yeah. Well, but I thought, in other words, did Tom Brady throw an interception? Yes, but he won the game. So in other words, we can micromanage the story of the Bible and then make that the purpose of the Bible and say, well, the purpose of Jesus dying is to get rid of all those interceptions on Tom Brady's record. Well, what if the story of Tom Brady is not how many interceptions he threw, how many Super Bowls he won? What if that's the story? And I would argue the same kind of logic is happening in the scripture. What's the most important story that we can give to Abraham? Not whether or not he sinned, but whether he did 26:5. And there it is. Abraham kept my voice, kept my charge, kept my commandments. So the story is the positive, element of what he accomplished. And I would say thus became righteous in Yahweh's mind, and not the negations that you could pile up behind his record. I often like to say I threw a lot less interceptions than Tom Brady in my life. Does that make me a better quarterback? No, because the way you judge a quarterback is by how many championships he wins. Why can't we do the same with the story of the Bible? The question is not how many sins Abraham commits. The question is which God he worships. And if we get it from that angle, then we have an answer to why Jesus dies, and that whole New Testament question of what about this, what about that when it comes to sin, I think makes good sense. But you've got to start in the right direction. Otherwise, you're going to end up, what I like to say in the wrong direction. So,
well,
anyway,
and to use the Tom Brady analogy, right? Like the Tom Brady analogy would mean very little to me as well if it wasn't that he won the majority, if not almost all of them, except for one, Super Bowl for the Patriots. And so in some sense, like where verse 5 says, Abraham obeyed my voice, like that's a very key line right there, right? Because it could have just been Abraham obeyed, kept, the charges, the commandments, the statutes, and the laws, but we wouldn't know like whose, like who was he directing this obedience towards? Like, why was he doing it? Who was he doing it for?
It's a who question.
Right. Like Brady wasn't just a quarterback for his own, like himself. He was a quarterback for, and this is an opinion, one of the greatest football teams out there. and then he switched. But in either case, there is that idea, right, that it was part of a greater whole. And I think sometimes I think you do have a good point that we get so granular that we become very obsessed about the minor marks and miss out on the direction of the loyalty of the allegiance, right? It's Abraham's obedience was because he was obeying Yahweh, this God that had approached him back all the way in chapter 12. And he lived that loyalty out for all his days. He had his terrible foul-ups, especially how he treated his wife. And yet, still somehow, that obedience, that loyalty expressed to Yahweh is what kept their relationship going. I think that's something that maybe as evangelicals, we often need to return to and be reminded of, that the relational aspect, the loyalty, the hesed, or the faithful love is very key to all the motivations that we do, like in what we do later on.
Yeah. And I was there once, so I'm, when I say this, I'm criticizing my own teaching, but how does the Reformed view handle 26:5, where it says Abraham did it? Abraham kept Torah. Usually the Reformed version goes with Romans 3, that nobody can keep Torah. Well, wait a second. Abraham did keep Torah. So I think reading the text in the order that we're doing it left to right, for me, drives home the fact that that Reformed idea that we start with sin and Jesus solves the sin problem is misguided, because that's not how the story was going. And Jesus came to fulfill Scripture, I would argue. Well, we all do that. But what Scripture does Jesus come to fulfill is the story of God sending someone to bring, Matthew 1:21, save his people from their sins of idolatry that led them into exile. Save his people. He's not saving everyone. He's saving the people who call upon the name of Yahweh. So, in other words, if you can even see the story of Jesus coming, before it happens in Matthew 1:21, without going to a Romans 3 and packing sin as the problem. You can, or at least Adamic guilt. I think Matthew 1:21 is talking about the sins of Jeroboam, the sins that led the people into the exile that they were in Matthew 1. So I'm just, I'm getting too far afield, but I think as I'm saying, and I hope you're agreeing there, that 26:5 is huge, because it's answering the question of which Elohim and how do you get righteous as early as we've seen now. A man is simply righteous because he follows the right God. All I want to do with the rest of the chapter, which again, our story of Isaac, I think we should read in the question, asking the question, which God did he follow? Verse 12, Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and Yahweh blessed him. Again, which God? It's Yahweh. This is after he did the sister wife thing, which Abraham did it in 12 and 20. And now here comes, like father, like son. We do the same kind of story, a little bit of different context. But the point of the story is, again, which God they're worshiping, even as they make a blunder, I think. The well being, filled in, stopped up, again, interesting to their worldview. I'll let the study Bibles give all the background for that. But notice how, again, the operative question comes up is starting in verse 23. Isaac went up there from there to Beersheba, and Yahweh appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. There's our which God question coming home to roost. This is the first occurrence in Genesis of this line, I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built, and again, key moment, he built an altar there and called on the name of Yahweh. And he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. So verse 25 again tells me this story is about which God Isaac worships. The way the chapter ends, Abimelech came to him from Gerar, and Isaac said to them, why have you come to see me, since you hate me? And they said, I love this line, we have certainly seen that Yahweh, I don't know if they would have used his name at this point, but we know which God we're talking about, is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us. In other words, this would be a classic case of being a good witness for your God, for your deity. People who otherwise would be your enemies would come to you and say, you worship a God that I want to worship. For whatever reason, I'm seeing effect of this God in your life. So this is the first occurrence of that phrase in Genesis. The Lord Yahweh is with you. It'll be said 4 times of Joseph later when he's down in Egypt.
I did just have an interesting kind of thought, right? Because when God shows up previously talking with Isaac, I think it was earlier, right? How like God blesses Isaac and how he, it was in verse 4. And in your offspring, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it very interesting that just Isaac's own, like, even though he had a blunder previously, but then he goes, he has this other appearance with Yahweh. And now these people who are not part of his family, a different people group, are coming and saying, hey, we've seen that this God of yours has blessed you. And they want to have a treaty. They want to be able to have a relationship. And so I find it interesting. It's like there's even a hint of that blessing that God talked about with Isaac earlier is starting to show up even here.
Yeah.
And just for, it's like last time that we talked about how Isaac's, like the way that Jacob would remember how his dad talked about Yahweh was that Yahweh was Jacob's fear, or the fear of Jacob, or the terror of Jacob. And yet in verse 24, Yahweh explicitly says, fear not.
Yeah, we're going to see that fear of Yahweh coming up. Oh, it's on the left side of my Bible here. Where is it? Well, yeah, we're going to see it coming. So, there it is, 31:42, the fear of Isaac. So that's an interesting way of describing Yahweh. The fear of
especially
Isaac.
If his only first encounter previously was on Mount Moriah.
Yeah, I know. You have a knife above your neck, and the fear of Yahweh. Good point. We can close it up with verse 34. Notice again the other side. Esau was 40. He took wives, Judith and the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. And of course, the why would the who you choose to marry be a problem to your parents? I'd recommend, because Isaac and Rebekah are Yahwists, and this has been a theme we've seen before, where Isaac gets his wife from the tribe, not from the land, the tribe of Abraham's family up north. The question of grief of mind is going immediately to the question of which deity do these girls/wives worship. And if anything, that's what that text is trying to remind us of, that Esau is going to marry into the family of Ishmael, frankly, by the time you get to chapter 36.
Yeah.
I'm done. If you are, Mike, anything else we want to wrap up with? Next time, of course, we'll pick up the story of Isaac being tricked. So,
yeah, I think we're good.
I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. And again, we trust these are helpful comments, working our way through a text, looking not at everything. I skipped over a lot of verses in chapter 26, for example, but we're looking for issues that deal with the divine counsel worldview, which are, I'd still say, almost in every story of the Bible, every story, every paragraph, there is something in that story that talks about the which God, which Elohim question. And to that we are attentive, I hope. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.